The gunshot that split the frozen air that December morning in 1882 was not meant for her, but Margaret Grayson heard it echo through the pines and knew her nightmare had only just begun. She had been traveling from Spokane Falls to Walla Walla, Washington, with a merchant caravan carrying winter supplies when the bandits struck just after dawn. The attack was swift and brutal, scattering the wagons across the snowy landscape like toys abandoned by a careless child. Margaret had run, her boots sinking deep into the powder with each desperate step, her breath coming in ragged clouds that hung in the bitter air. The temperature had dropped viciously overnight, and now the world was a blinding white wilderness that offered no mercy to the lost or the hunted. She had made it perhaps half a mile from the ambush site before her lungs began to burn and her legs trembled with exhaustion. The snowdrift rose before her like a wall, stretching 15 feet high where the wind had piled it against a rocky outcropping. She pressed herself against it, gasping, her dark hair plastered to her face with sweat despite the cold. Behind her, she could hear them coming, their voices carrying across the pristine landscape with terrible clarity. She went this way. I saw her tracks. Pretty little thing like that will fetch a good price across the border. Forget selling her. I got other plans. Margaret's hands shook as she pressed deeper into the drift, the snow accepting her body like quicksand. She was 22 years old, a schoolteacher bound for a new position in Walla Walla, and she had never known fear like this. Her father had died 2 years prior, her mother just last spring, and she had no one left in Spokane Falls to mourn her if she disappeared into this frozen hell. The realization made her want to weep, but she bit down hard on her lip and forced herself to think. There had to be a way out. There had to be. The bandits emerged from the tree line like wolves, 6 men on horseback, their faces obscured by heavy scarves and wide-brimmed hats. The leader was a massive brute with a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, visible even beneath his coverings. He pulled his horse to a stop and surveyed the snowdrift with cruel amusement. "Come on out, sweetheart," he called, his voice thick with false sweetness. "We ain't going to hurt you." Much. The others laughed, a sound that made Margaret's skin crawl. She was trapped utterly and completely. The drift was at her back, the bandits spread out before her in a loose semicircle. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. She thought of her mother's Bible, packed carefully in her traveling case, probably lost now in the scattered wreckage of the caravan. She thought of the students she would never teach, the life she would never live. "I see you there, girl," the scarred man said, swinging down from his horse. "Might as well make this easy on yourself." 2 more men dismounted, their hands moving to the revolvers at their hips. Margaret pressed herself harder against the snow, feeling it give way beneath her, and realized with distant surprise that she had stopped being afraid. Instead, a strange calm had settled over her, cold and clear as the winter sky above. If this was how she died, then at least she would die fighting. She was reaching for the small derringer she kept hidden in her coat pocket when the first shot rang out. The man to the scarred leader's left dropped like a stone, a spray of red painting the snow behind him. The sound of the rifle shot followed a split second later, echoing off the mountains. Before anyone could react, a second shot cracked through the air and another bandit fell, clutching his chest. "What the hell?" the leader roared, spinning around, his revolver drawn. A third shot, and a third man went down, this one toppling from his horse with a strangled cry. The remaining 3 bandits were scrambling now, trying to find cover, to locate their attacker, but the shots came from somewhere high and distant, and the shooter was invisible against the blinding white landscape. The 4th shot took down a man who had almost made it back to his horse. He collapsed face first into the snow and did not move. Margaret watched all of this happen in the space of perhaps 10 seconds, her mind struggling to process the sudden reversal of fortune. She stayed frozen against the snowdrift, afraid to move, afraid to believe that salvation had actually arrived. The scarred leader and one remaining bandit had taken cover behind their horses, their revolvers drawn but useless at this range. Margaret could see the panic in their movements, the way they kept looking around wildly, trying to spot the shooter. Then, movement caught her eye. A figure on horseback was emerging from the pines to the east, rifle still raised to his shoulder. He was perhaps 200 yards away, an impossible distance for accurate shooting, yet he had just dropped 4 men without appearing to miss once. The scarred leader saw him too and made a decision. He vaulted back onto his horse and spurred it hard, fleeing west across the open ground. His companion followed, and the two of them disappeared into the forest within moments, leaving their dead and wounded behind. The rider approached slowly, his rifle now resting across his saddle but still ready. As he drew closer, Margaret could make out more details. He was tall and lean, dressed in a heavy wool coat and leather chaps, a dark Stetson pulled low over his face. His horse was a magnificent bay gelding, sure-footed in the deep snow. When he was perhaps 20 feet away, he finally lowered the rifle completely and pushed back his hat. Margaret found herself staring into the most striking gray eyes she had ever seen. They were the color of storm clouds, set in a face that was weathered but young, probably no more than 26 or 27. He had several days' worth of dark stubble on his jaw and a mouth set in a grim line. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, her pressed against the snowdrift, him sitting tall in his saddle. "You hurt, miss?" he asked finally. His voice was deep and rough, but not unkind. Margaret found her own voice with difficulty. "No, no, I am not hurt, thank you." "You saved my life." He nodded once, as if this was simply a fact that required no discussion, and swung down from his horse. Up close, he was even taller than she had thought, perhaps 6 feet 2 inches, with broad shoulders and the easy, economical movements of a man comfortable in his own skin. He walked past her to check on the fallen bandits, his boots crunching in the snow. After a moment, he returned to her side. "4 dead," he reported. "The other 2 got away, but they won't come back. Not today, anyway." "Who are you?" Margaret asked. She was shivering now, the cold and the shock of the last few minutes finally catching up to her. "Name is Gideon Walker," he said. "I was tracking this gang for the better part of a week. They hit a supply train near Spokane Falls 5 days ago, killed 3 men. I am a deputy marshal out of Walla Walla." "Walla Walla," Margaret repeated, seizing on the familiar name. "That is where I was going. I am a school teacher. I was supposed to start my position after the new year, but the caravan I was traveling with was attacked this morning." Gideon's gray eyes sharpened with concern. "How many survivors?" "I do not know. I ran. I could hear shooting, but I do not know who lived or died." Shame colored her voice, but Gideon shook his head. "You did the right thing," he said firmly. "Running was smart. Staying would have just gotten you killed." He looked around at the landscape, assessing. "We need to get you somewhere warm. You are already half frozen and there is another storm coming in tonight. Can you ride?" "Yes," Margaret said, though in truth she was not sure her trembling legs would support her. Gideon seemed to sense her uncertainty. He moved closer and offered his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Margaret took it. His grip was strong and warm even through their gloves, and he pulled her easily from the snowdrift where she had been trapped. She stumbled slightly, and his other hand came up to steady her elbow. "Easy," he murmured. "You are safe now." Something in his voice, in the calm certainty of his presence, made Margaret want to believe him. She looked up at him, This stranger who had appeared like something out of a legend and cut down her attackers with ruthless efficiency, and felt a strange flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. "Thank you," she said again, inadequately. Gideon held her gaze for a moment longer, then stepped back and turned to his horse. "We will ride double back to the caravan site, see if there are any other survivors. Then we make for the way station at Mill Creek. It is only about 8 miles from here. We should reach it before dark if we move quickly." He swung up into the saddle with easy grace, then reached down to her. Margaret took his hand again and allowed him to pull her up behind him. The intimacy of the position made her blush despite the circumstances. She had to wrap her arms around his waist to keep her seat, and she could feel the solid warmth of his body even through their heavy coats. "Hold on," Gideon said, and urged his horse into a steady trot back toward the tree line. The caravan site was a scene of devastation. 2 wagons had been overturned, their contents scattered across the blood-stained snow. 3 bodies lay where they had fallen, and Margaret recognized the merchant who had hired her passage, old Samuel Brennan, among the dead. Her eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back fiercely. There would be time to grieve later. "Anyone alive here?" Gideon called out, his voice carrying across the clearing. A groan answered him, and they found one of the wagon drivers badly wounded but still breathing, half buried in snow where he had crawled seeking shelter. Gideon dismounted quickly and went to him, his hands gentle as he examined the injury. "Gut shot," he said quietly to Margaret. "He will not make it to Mill Creek." "We have to try," Margaret said, sliding down from the horse. "We cannot just leave him." Gideon looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his storm-gray eyes. Then he nodded. "Help me get him on the horse. You will have to walk for a bit." They managed to get the wounded man, whose name was Patrick, draped across Gideon's saddle. Margaret walked alongside, her hand on Patrick's back to steady him, while Gideon led the horse. It was slow, exhausting work. The snow was knee-deep in places, and the cold bit through Margaret's clothing with savage teeth. Her fingers and toes went numb, and her breath came in harsh gasps, but she kept moving. Gideon never complained, never suggested they leave Patrick behind, and Margaret found herself admiring his quiet determination. Patrick died an hour into their journey, slipping away so quietly that Margaret did not realize he was gone until Gideon stopped and checked his pulse. "He is at peace now," Gideon said softly. He lifted the body down and laid it respectfully beside a large pine tree. "We will come back for him when the weather clears. I will mark this spot." He carved a quick mark into the tree trunk with his knife, then turned back to Margaret. She was swaying on her feet, exhausted and half frozen. Without a word, Gideon picked her up and set her on his horse, then swung up behind her. This time he was the one holding her, one arm around her waist, keeping her secure against his chest. "Sleep if you can," he said, his breath warm against her ear. "I will get us to Mill Creek." Margaret meant to protest, meant to insist she could stay awake, but the warmth of his body and the steady rhythm of the horse's gait conspired against her. Her eyes drifted closed and she knew no more. She woke to firelight and blessed warmth. For a moment she was disoriented, unsure of where she was or how she had gotten there. Then memory returned in a rush, and she sat up quickly, looking around. She was in a small cabin, lying on a narrow bed with several heavy blankets piled over her. A fire crackled merrily in a stone fireplace, and she could smell something cooking, some kind of stew or soup. "Easy," Gideon's voice came from across the room. "You are safe. We made it to Mill Creek." Margaret turned to see him sitting at a rough wooden table, cleaning his rifle with careful, practiced movements. He had removed his coat and hat, and she could see that his dark hair was slightly too long, curling at the nape of his neck. In the firelight, he looked younger, less intimidating than he had out in the wilderness. "How long was I asleep?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "About 3 hours. It is nearly dark now." He set aside the rifle and rose, moving to the fireplace where a pot hung over the flames. "You need to eat something. When was the last time you had a meal?" Margaret had to think about it. "Yesterday morning, I suppose, before we left Spokane Falls." Gideon nodded and ladled some of the stew into a tin bowl. He brought it to her along with a spoon and a hunk of bread that looked slightly stale but still edible. "It is not much, but it will keep your strength up. We will stay here tonight and head for Walla Walla in the morning if the weather holds." "Is this your cabin?" Margaret asked, accepting the bowl gratefully. The stew was simple, just beans and salt pork and some dried vegetables, but it was hot and filling. "No, it belongs to the territory. Way station for travelers and marshals. There are a few scattered throughout this region." He returned to his seat and watched her eat with those disconcerting gray eyes. "You should wire ahead when we reach Walla Walla. Let your employer know you are alive. I am sure news of the caravan attack will reach town before we do, and they may think you were killed." "I have no one to wire," Margaret said without thinking, then regretted the words immediately. They made her sound pathetic, alone. Which she supposed she was. Gideon's expression softened slightly. "No family. My parents are both deceased. I have some cousins back east, but we have not spoken in years. The teaching position in Walla Walla was meant to be a fresh start." She managed a small, bitter smile. "It seems to be off to an inauspicious beginning." "You are alive," Gideon said simply. "That counts for something." "Thanks to you." Margaret set aside the empty bowl and looked at him directly. "You must have been following those bandits very closely to arrive at exactly the right moment." "I was tracking them," Gideon confirmed. "I spotted the caravan at first light and was moving in to warn the wagon master when the attack began. By the time I got there, you had already run and the bandits were hunting you. I followed and took my shots when I had a clear field." He paused. "I am sorry I could not get there sooner." "I am sorry about the others who died." "You did everything you could," Margaret said. "More than that, you are an excellent shot." "I spent 3 years as an Army scout before becoming a marshal. I learned to shoot, among other things." He stood and moved to the window, looking out at the gathering darkness. "Storm is coming in. We may be stuck here for a day or two if it is as bad as I think it will be." The thought of being trapped in this small cabin with Gideon Walker, this stranger who had saved her life, should have alarmed Margaret. Instead, she felt oddly safe, more secure than she had in months. There was something about him, something steady and dependable, that called to her. "Tell me about Walla Walla," she said, wanting to break the silence. "What is it like?" Gideon turned back to her, and a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. It transformed his face, making him look younger and more approachable. "It is growing fast. Maybe 1,500 people now, more arriving every month. The railroad will be there within a few years, everyone says, and that will bring even more. It is a good town, rough in places but decent overall. You will be safe there." "Are you from there originally?" "No. I grew up in Missouri, came west after the war. I was just a boy then, but old enough to know I did not want to stay in a place with so many bad memories." He returned to the table and sat down again, his long legs stretched out before him. "I worked cattle drives for a while, then signed on with the Army as a scout like I said. Became a deputy marshal 2 years ago. The work suits me." "It is dangerous work," Margaret observed. "So is teaching school in a frontier town," Gideon countered, and there was amusement in his voice. "You will have your hands full with miners' children and farmers' sons who think they know better than some Eastern schoolmarm." Margaret bristled slightly at the term, then saw the teasing glint in his eyes and found herself smiling instead. "I am tougher than I look, Marshall Walker." "I believe you are, Miss Grayson. You kept your head today when most women would have fallen apart. That takes courage." The compliment, delivered in his straightforward way, made Margaret feel warm. She pulled the blankets more securely around herself and tried to ignore the impropriety of her situation. She was alone with a man she had known for less than a day, preparing to spend the night in a one-room cabin with only him for company. It was scandalous, the sort of thing that could ruin her reputation if word got out. But what choice did she have? And truthfully, she did not much care about scandal at the moment. She was alive, warm, and fed. Everything else seemed secondary. "You should get more sleep," Gideon said, as if reading her thoughts. "I will keep watch and tend the fire. We have a long ride ahead of us tomorrow. What about you? You must be exhausted." "I am used to it." He pulled out a deck of worn playing cards from his pocket and began shuffling them idly, a habit to occupy his hands. "I can sleep light and wake at any sound. Go on, rest. I will wake you if anything happens." Margaret wanted to argue, but exhaustion was pulling at her again, and the bed was warm and soft compared to the frozen hell she had endured earlier. She lay back down and closed her eyes, listening to the crackle of the fire and the soft whisper of cards being shuffled. Despite everything, or perhaps because of it, she felt safe. Gideon Walker was a guardian angel in denim and leather, and she was beginning to realize that she wanted to know more about him, much more. The storm hit just after midnight, howling around the cabin like a living thing. Margaret woke to the sound of wind shrieking through the eaves and snow battering the window with icy fists. The fire had burned low, casting dancing shadows across the walls, and she could see Gideon still sitting at the table, now reading a battered book by the light of a small oil lamp. "Is it bad?" she asked, sitting up. He looked over at her, and she saw the concern in his eyes even though his voice remained calm. "Bad enough. We will not be leaving in the morning, that is certain. This is going to blow for at least a day, maybe more. I am sorry. You must have other duties, other places you need to be." "Nothing that cannot wait. My job right now is to get you safely to Walla Walla, and I intend to do just that." He closed the book and stood, moving to the fireplace to add more wood. "Are you hungry?" "There is more stew, and I found some coffee in the stores here." "Coffee sounds wonderful," Margaret admitted. She rose from the bed, keeping one of the blankets wrapped around her shoulders, and moved to join him by the fire. The cabin was small enough that they could not help but be in close proximity, and she was acutely aware of his presence, his size and strength, the quiet competence with which he moved. Gideon prepared the coffee in a battered tin pot, setting it on the edge of the fire to heat. While they waited, Margaret found herself studying him in the flickering light. He had a strong profile, a straight nose and firm jaw, and there was a small scar above his left eyebrow that she had not noticed before. His hands, when they moved to adjust the pot, were long-fingered and capable, the hands of a man who had done hard work all his life. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, catching her staring. Margaret felt heat rush to her cheeks. "I was thinking that I know almost nothing about you, despite the fact that you saved my life and I am now trapped in a cabin with you during a blizzard. It seems like I should know more." Gideon smiled at that, a real smile this time that reached his eyes and made them warm. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," Margaret said honestly. "Where you came from, what you want, who you are beyond just Marshall Gideon Walker." He poured coffee into 2 tin cups and handed her one, then settled down beside her, both of them sitting on the floor with their backs against the wall, facing the fire. It was companionable, intimate in a way that had nothing to do with impropriety and everything to do with human connection. "I told you I am from Missouri originally," he began. "Small town called Liberty, north of Kansas City. My father was a farmer. My mother died when I was 8. Fever took her. My father remarried a year later, and my stepmother was not a kind woman. I left home at 15, lied about my age to work cattle drives. Spent the next few years moving from ranch to ranch, learning the trade. When the Army came looking for scouts who knew the land and could handle themselves, I signed on. 3 years of that, tracking hostile bands, keeping settlers safe. Then I met a marshal named Bill Harmon who thought I had potential for law work. He sponsored me, taught me what I needed to know, and here I am." "That is quite a life for someone who cannot be much older than 27, Margaret observed. 26, Gideon corrected. "I will be 27 in March. What about you, Miss Grayson? What brought you west? Please call me Margaret." "After everything we have been through, I think we can dispense with formality." She sipped her coffee, grateful for its warmth. "My story is much less adventurous than yours. I was born in Boston, came to Spokane Falls with my parents when I was 12. My father thought there were opportunities out here for a man willing to work hard. He opened a dry goods store and we made a good life. I went to the Teachers Academy in Spokane Falls, earned my certificate, and taught there for 2 years. Then my father died of pneumonia, and my mother followed him a year later. Broken heart, I think, though the doctor said it was consumption. The store was sold to pay debts, and I found myself alone with very little. The position in Walla Walla was advertised in the newspaper, and I applied. They accepted me, and so here I am, or at least trying to be." "I am sorry about your parents," Gideon said quietly. "It is hard, losing the people who anchor you to the world." "Yes," Margaret agreed. "It is like being adrift in a vast ocean with no shore in sight." She paused, then added, "But perhaps that is not entirely a bad thing. Perhaps it means I can chart my own course now, go where I choose, become who I want to be." Gideon looked at her with something like admiration. "That is a brave way to look at it." "I am not brave," Margaret said. "I am terrified most of the time. But I have learned that terror does not prevent you from moving forward. You just have to keep putting one foot in front of the other." "That is the definition of courage," Gideon said. "Being afraid and doing it anyway." They fell silent for a while, drinking their coffee and listening to the storm rage outside. Margaret found herself profoundly glad that she was not alone out there in the darkness and cold. She glanced sideways at Gideon and found him looking at her, his gray eyes thoughtful. "What?" she asked, self-conscious. "You are different from what I expected," he said slowly, as if choosing his words carefully. "When I saw you trapped against that snowdrift this morning, I thought you would be hysterical, demanding, the sort of woman who cannot function outside of drawing rooms and tea parties. But you are not. You are strong and practical, and you do not complain. I admire that." Margaret felt something flutter in her chest again, that strange, warm feeling that had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with the man beside her. "You barely know me, Marshal Walker. Perhaps I am just good at hiding my weaknesses." "Gideon," he corrected. "And no, I do not think that is it. I am a pretty good judge of character. Comes with the job." "Gideon," Margaret repeated, and liked the way his name felt in her mouth. "Thank you for everything you have done. I would be dead if not for you." "You would have found a way to survive," Gideon said. "You are a survivor, Margaret Grayson. I could see that from the first moment." The way he said her name, low and warm, made her shiver despite the heat from the fire. She was suddenly, acutely aware of how close they were sitting, how easy it would be to lean over and close the distance between them. The thought shocked her with its intensity. She barely knew this man, yet she felt drawn to him in a way she had never experienced before. As if sensing her thoughts, Gideon shifted slightly, putting a more respectable distance between them. "You should try to sleep some more," he said, his voice slightly rough. "It is going to be a long day tomorrow, storm or no storm." Margaret nodded and rose reluctantly to return to the bed. But as she lay there in the darkness, listening to Gideon move around the cabin, she knew that sleep would be a long time coming. Something had changed between them during that conversation by the fire. Some invisible line had been crossed, and she was not sure what it meant or where it would lead. All she knew was that Gideon Walker had saved her life, and in doing so, had awakened something in her that she had thought long dead, some capacity for hope and connection that she had buried with her parents. The storm blew for 2 full days, trapping them in the cabin as effectively as any prison. They fell into an easy routine. Gideon would wake early and tend to his horse, which was sheltered in the small stable attached to the cabin, then return to make breakfast from their limited supplies. Margaret would clean up and organize their small space, trying to bring some order to the frontier chaos. They would talk, for hours sometimes, sharing stories of their lives and dreams. Margaret learned that Gideon had once been in love with a girl in Missouri, but she had married someone else while he was away on a cattle drive. He spoke of it matter-of-factly, without bitterness, but Margaret sensed the old hurt beneath his words. He learned that she had never been courted seriously, that most men in Spokane Falls had seen her as too educated, too independent for their tastes. "Their loss," Gideon said when she admitted this, and the sincerity in his voice made her blush. On the second evening, as they sat by the fire after their simple supper, Gideon taught her to play poker using his worn deck of cards. Margaret proved to be an apt student, winning more hands than she lost, and their laughter filled the cabin, warm and genuine. At one point, their hands brushed as they both reached for the deck, and the contact sent a jolt through Margaret that had nothing to do with static electricity. Gideon felt it too. She could see it in the way his eyes darkened, the way his breath caught for just a moment. He withdrew his hand slowly, deliberately, and cleared his throat. "I should check on the horse," he said, standing abruptly. Margaret watched him pull on his coat and step out into the dying storm, and she knew with absolute certainty that she was falling in love with him. The realization should have terrified her, but instead it filled her with a strange, fierce joy. She was alive, truly alive for the first time in years. When Gideon returned, stamping snow from his boots, he found her still sitting by the fire, the cards forgotten in her lap. "Storm is breaking," he reported. "We should be able to leave in the morning if the weather holds." "That is good news," Margaret said, though her voice lacked conviction. Gideon crossed the cabin and knelt beside her, his gray eyes searching her face. "Is it?" he asked quietly. "You do not sound convinced." Margaret met his gaze and made a decision. Life was too short, too uncertain to hide behind propriety and fear. "I will miss this," she said honestly. "These 2 days with you, I know it is foolish, we barely know each other, but I will miss it nonetheless." Something shifted in Gideon's expression, some wall coming down. "It is not foolish," he said, his voice rough. "I will miss it too, I will miss you. We will both be in Walla Walla," Margaret pointed out. "It is not as if we will never see each other again." "No," Gideon agreed. "But it will be different there. You will be the respectable school teacher, and I will be the deputy marshal. We will have to observe proprieties, be careful of your reputation. It will not be like this, just the two of us without the rest of the world intruding." "I do not care about propriety," Margaret said fiercely. "I have lost too much, been alone too long. I will not lose this too, whatever this is, just because society says it is improper." Gideon reached up and cupped her face with one large, calloused hand. "Margaret," he said, and her name was a question and a prayer all at once. She leaned into his touch, covering his hand with her own. "I know it is too soon. I know we should be sensible. But I have spent my entire life being sensible, doing what was expected of me, and where has it gotten me? Alone and nearly killed by bandits in a snowstorm. Maybe it is time I stopped being sensible." "You deserve more than a frontier marshal with a dangerous job and uncertain prospects," Gideon said, but he did not pull away. "You deserve more than a penniless schoolteacher with no family and a stubborn streak," Margaret countered. "But perhaps what we deserve and what we need are not the same thing." Gideon smiled at that, a slow, genuine smile that transformed his face. "You are unlike any woman I have ever met," he said softly. "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" "It is a wonderful thing," Gideon said, and then he was kissing her, his lips warm and gentle against hers. Margaret had been kissed before, fumbling stolen kisses from boys at church socials, but nothing had prepared her for this. Gideon kissed her like she was precious, like she was something to be cherished, and she found herself responding with a passion that surprised them both. His arms came around her, pulling her close, and she went willingly, her hands tangling in his too long hair. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Gideon rested his forehead against hers. "I am not sorry," he said. "I know I should be, but I am not." "Good," Margaret said, slightly breathless. "Because I am not either." They sat there for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms, listening to the wind die outside. The storm was ending, but something new was beginning, something neither of them had planned for but both desperately wanted. "Come with me to Walla Walla," Gideon said finally. "Not just as someone I am escorting, but as someone I am courting. Let me do this properly, Margaret. Let me court you and show you what kind of man I can be." "You have already shown me what kind of man you are," Margaret said. "You are brave and honorable and kind. You saved my life without hesitation. What more could I possibly need to know? Whether you can tolerate me for more than 2 days in a cabin," Gideon said, and there was humor in his voice now. "I've been told I can be stubborn and overly serious." "I've been told I can be stubborn and overly independent," Margaret countered. "Perhaps we will balance each other out." "Perhaps we will," Gideon agreed and kissed her again, slow and sweet and full of promise. They left at dawn the next morning, riding through a world transformed by the storm. The snow lay deep and pristine, sparkling in the early light like scattered diamonds. Gideon rode with Margaret in front of him this time, his arms around her both for warmth, and because neither of them wanted to give up the contact. The journey to Walla Walla took 2 days, camping one night in a sheltered hollow where Gideon built a fire and they slept wrapped in blankets, curled together for warmth. When they finally rode into Walla Walla on a crisp January afternoon, Margaret felt as if she were arriving home rather than entering a strange town. The streets were busy with commerce, miners and farmers and merchants going about their business. The buildings were a mix of wood and brick, some quite substantial, others still rough frontier constructions. Gideon guided his horse through the main street and stopped in front of a neat white building with a sign that read Walla Walla School. "This is where you will be teaching," he said. "The schoolmaster is a man named Horace Winters. He is fair but strict. You will like him." "And where will you be?" Margaret asked, reluctant to dismount and end their journey together. "The marshal's office is just down the street. I have rooms above the office." He paused, then added quietly, "I will call on you this evening if you are amenable. We can take supper at the hotel dining room." "I would like that very much," Margaret said. Gideon helped her down from the horse, his hands lingering at her waist. For a moment they simply stood there, looking at each other, heedless of the curious glances from passers-by. "Until tonight, then," Gideon said finally. "Until tonight," Margaret agreed. She watched him ride away, her heart full and aching at the same time. Then she squared her shoulders, picked up her small traveling case, which Gideon had retrieved from the caravan wreckage before they left Mill Creek, and walked up the steps to meet her new employer. Horace Winters was a scholarly man in his 50s with wire-rimmed spectacles and a kind smile. He welcomed Margaret warmly, expressing relief that she had survived the bandit attack, which had indeed reached Walla Walla ahead of her thanks to the two bandits, who had escaped spreading tales of a deadly marksman who had cut down their fellows. Margaret confirmed the story and gave credit to Deputy Marshal Walker, which made Horace nod approvingly. "Gideon Walker is one of the finest lawmen in the territory," Horace said. "You were fortunate he was there." "I was," Margaret agreed softly. Horace showed her to her quarters, a small but comfortable room attached to the school building, and left her to settle in. Margaret unpacked her few belongings, washed her face in the basin provided, and changed into her one good dress, a deep blue wool that brought out the color of her eyes. She was nervous, she realized, more nervous than she had been facing down bandits. Tonight would be the first time she and Gideon would be in public together as a couple, at least potentially, and she was not sure what to expect. He arrived exactly at 6 o'clock, knocking politely at her door. When she opened it, she found him transformed. He had shaved, his hair was neatly combed, and he wore a clean white shirt with a string tie, a leather vest, and dark trousers. He was still unmistakably a frontier lawman, but he had made an effort, and Margaret appreciated it. "You look beautiful," he said, his gray eyes warming as they took her in. "You look rather handsome yourself, Marshal Walker," Margaret replied, smiling. He offered his arm, and she took it, feeling the solid strength of him beneath the fabric of his shirt. They walked together through the quiet evening streets to the hotel, where the dining room was already half full with townspeople enjoying their supper. Heads turned as they entered, and Margaret could feel the curious glances, the whispered speculation. No doubt by morning the entire town would know that the new schoolteacher was being courted by Deputy Marshal Walker. Gideon seemed oblivious to the attention, or perhaps he simply did not care. He saw Margaret seated, then took the chair across from her, his long legs folded awkwardly beneath the small table. They ordered simply, roast beef and potatoes and vegetables, and made quiet conversation while they waited for their food. "How was your meeting with Winters?" Gideon asked. "He seems like a good man. I start teaching next week after the holiday break ends. There are 43 students ages 6 to 16, all in one room. It will be challenging, but I am looking forward to it." Margaret paused, then asked, "What about you? Did you report in about the bandits?" "I did. The marshal was pleased that 4 of them are dead, though he would have preferred them alive for trial. I explained the circumstances, and he accepted my judgment." Gideon's expression darkened slightly. "The 2 who got away are still out there somewhere. I will be riding out in a few days to continue tracking them." Margaret felt a chill at the thought of him riding back out into danger, but she kept her voice steady. "Will you be gone long?" "However long it takes. Could be a few days, could be a few weeks. That is the nature of the work." "I understand," Margaret said, and she did, even though she did not like it. This was his job, his calling, and she could not ask him to change it any more than he could ask her to stop teaching. Their food arrived, and they ate in companionable silence for a while. Then Gideon reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb stroking gently over her knuckles. "I know this is not what you imagined when you came to Walla Walla," he said quietly. "Being courted by a marshal, knowing I might ride out and not come back. If it is too much, if you want to step back and just be friends, I will understand." Margaret tightened her grip on his hand. "I did not survive a bandit attack and 2 days in a blizzard just to play it safe now, Gideon Walker. Yes, your job is dangerous. Yes, I will worry every time you ride out. But I would rather have you in my life, however uncertain, than go back to being alone." Something fierce and tender flashed in Gideon's eyes. "You are extraordinary," he said softly. "I am practical," Margaret corrected. "I know what I want, and I am not afraid to reach for it." "And what do you want?" Gideon asked, though his smile suggested he already knew the answer. "You," Margaret said simply. "I want you, Gideon. I want to see where this goes, whatever happens." They finished their meal and walked back through the town, which was growing quiet as night fell. When they reached the school, Gideon walked her to her door but did not immediately take his leave. He stood there in the gathering darkness, looking down at her with those storm-gray eyes that had haunted her dreams. "I will call on you again tomorrow, if you will let me," he said. "I will let you," Margaret replied. "I will always let you." Gideon bent and kissed her, gentle and chaste because they were in public and her reputation mattered, but no less meaningful for its restraint. When he pulled back, he touched her cheek softly. "Good night, Margaret." "Good night, Gideon." She watched him walk away into the night, his tall figure eventually disappearing into shadow, and she knew with absolute certainty that she was in love with him. It had happened impossibly fast, this connection between them, but it was no less real for its speed. He had saved her life, yes, but more than that, he had reminded her that life was worth living, worth fighting for. The next weeks passed in a blur of happiness. Margaret threw herself into teaching, finding joy in the eager faces of her students and the challenge of managing so many different ages and abilities in one room. She earned their respect through a combination of firmness and kindness, and within days, the children adored her. Gideon called on her nearly every evening when he was in town, and they took long walks together, talking about everything and nothing, learning each other in the way new couples do. He introduced her to the other deputies, and to the marshal himself, a gruff but fair man named Jack Thornton, who clearly respected Gideon. Margaret invited Gideon to supper in her small quarters, cooking simple meals on her little stove, and he praised her efforts extravagantly, even when the biscuits were burned and the stew too salty. They attended church together on Sundays, sitting side by side in the wooden pews, and Margaret noticed the approving looks from the other townspeople. The school teacher and the marshal made a good match, people whispered, and Margaret found she agreed with them. But always, hanging over their happiness, was the knowledge that Gideon's job might take him away at any moment. 3 weeks after their arrival in Walla Walla, the call came. A stagecoach had been robbed 50 miles north, and the descriptions of 2 of the robbers matched the bandits who had escaped from Margaret's attack. Marshal Thornton assigned Gideon to lead a posse to track them down. He came to tell Margaret in the evening, his face grim. She knew immediately what he was going to say, and her heart sank. "I have to go," he said without preamble. "Those men are still out there, still hurting people. I have to finish this." "I know," Margaret said, though the words cost her. "When do you leave?" "At dawn tomorrow." "I am taking 3 other deputies with me. We will get them this time, Margaret. I promise." She wanted to rage at him, to beg him not to go, to tell him that she could not bear the thought of losing him. But she knew that would be selfish, that he was doing what he had sworn to do, protecting people who could not protect themselves. So instead she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, holding him tight. "Come back to me," she whispered against his chest. "Promise me you will come back." Gideon's arms came around her, strong and sure. "I promise," he said fiercely. "I will always come back to you, Margaret, always." They held each other for a long time, taking comfort in the warmth and solidity of the other's presence. Then Gideon tilted her face up and kissed her, deep and passionate, a kiss full of promise and longing. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "I love you," Gideon said, the words raw and honest. "I should have said it before, but I am saying it now. I love you, Margaret Grayson." Tears filled Margaret's eyes, but they were happy tears. "I love you too, Gideon Walker. I have loved you since that moment in the cabin when you taught me to play poker and laughed like you did not have a care in the world." He smiled at that, his thumb brushing away her tears. "When I get back, I am going to ask you to marry me properly. I am going to get a ring and go down on one knee and do it right, but I am telling you now so you have time to think about your answer." "I do not need time to think," Margaret said, laughing through her tears. "The answer is yes." It has always been yes. Gideon kissed her again, then reluctantly released her. "I have to go. I need to prepare for tomorrow." "Then go," Margaret said, even though it hurt. "But come back to me, Gideon. Please come back." "I will," he promised, and then he was gone, leaving Margaret alone with her fears and her love. The next 10 days were the longest of Margaret's life. She threw herself into teaching, spending every waking hour with her students or preparing lessons, anything to keep her mind occupied. At night, she lay awake in her narrow bed and prayed for Gideon's safety, imagining 1,000 different disasters that might befall him. The other townspeople were kind, offering words of encouragement and assurances that Gideon was the best tracker in the territory, that he would be fine. But their words did little to ease her worry. On the 11th day, word came that the posse was returning. Margaret was in the middle of a grammar lesson when Horace Winters burst into the schoolroom, his face flushed with excitement. "They are back," he announced. "The posse is riding in now." Margaret dismissed her students early and hurried out to the main street, her heart pounding. A crowd had already gathered, and she pushed through them anxiously, searching for a familiar tall figure. Then she saw him, riding at the head of the group, dusty and tired but unmistakably alive and whole. 2 men rode with their hands bound, prisoners being brought in for trial. Gideon's eyes found her in the crowd, and his face broke into a smile. He dismounted quickly and came straight to her, heedless of the watching townspeople, and pulled her into his arms. "I am back," he said into her hair. "I told you I would come back." Margaret was laughing and crying at the same time, clutching him tightly. "You kept your promise." "I always will," Gideon said fiercely. Marshal Thornton cleared his throat pointedly. "Walker, we need to get these prisoners secured." Gideon released Margaret reluctantly. "I will come to you as soon as I can," he promised. "Wait for me." "I will wait forever if I have to," Margaret said, and meant it. It was nearly midnight before Gideon finally appeared at her door, cleaned up and changed but looking exhausted. Margaret had waited up for him, too anxious to sleep, and she opened the door before he had even finished knocking. "You should be resting," she scolded gently, even as she pulled him inside. "I had to see you," Gideon said. "I have been thinking about this for 10 days straight, and I cannot wait any longer." To Margaret's surprise, he went down on one knee right there in her small parlor, producing a simple gold band from his pocket. It was not fancy, but it gleamed warmly in the lamplight. "Margaret Grayson, I know I do not have much to offer you. My job is dangerous and I am gone more than I am home. But I love you with everything I am, and I promise I will spend the rest of my life trying to make you happy. Will you marry me?" Margaret dropped to her knees beside him, taking his face in her hands. "Yes," she said fiercely. "Yes, Gideon Walker, I will marry you. Today, tomorrow, whenever you want. Just yes." Gideon slipped the ring onto her finger where it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Then he was kissing her, and she was kissing him back, and for a long moment the rest of the world faded away, leaving only the two of them and their love. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church on Main Street, with Marshall Thornton standing up as best man, and the wife of the town doctor serving as Margaret's matron of honor. It was a simple ceremony, attended by half the town, and Margaret wore a white dress that she had sewn herself from fabric purchased at the general store. Gideon wore his best suit and looked so handsome that Margaret could barely speak her vows without crying. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Gideon kissed her to cheers and applause from the gathered townspeople. They held a small reception in the hotel dining room, with cake and punch and music from a fiddler who played lively tunes that had everyone dancing. Margaret danced with her new husband, her heart so full she thought it might burst, and knew that she had found what she had been searching for all her life. They moved into a small house on the edge of town, a tidy 2-bedroom place with a garden plot that Gideon promised to help her cultivate come spring. Margaret continued teaching, and Gideon continued his work as a deputy marshal, but now they had each other to come home to at the end of each day. The dangerous nature of his job did not change, and there were still nights when Margaret lay awake worrying while he was out tracking outlaws or escorting prisoners. But he always came back to her, just as he had promised, and their love only grew stronger with each passing month. A year after their wedding, Margaret discovered she was with child. She told Gideon one evening over supper, watching nervously for his reaction. His face lit up with such pure joy that she started crying, and he came around the table to kneel beside her chair and put his hands gently on her still flat stomach. "A baby," he said, wonder in his voice. "Our baby. Are you happy?" Margaret asked, even though she could see the answer in his face. "I am more than happy," Gideon said. "I am blessed. You have given me everything, Margaret. A home, a family, a reason to come back safe every time I ride out. I love you more than I can say." "I love you too," Margaret whispered, running her fingers through his dark hair. "So very much." Their son was born the following spring, a healthy boy with his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair. They named him Samuel after Margaret's father, and he was the light of their lives. Gideon proved to be an attentive, devoted father, spending every free moment with his son, teaching him to ride as soon as he could walk, reading to him from Margaret's books, playing endless games in the garden. When Samuel was 2, Margaret gave birth to a daughter they named Grace, and then 3 years after that, another daughter named Rose. Their house was full of noise and laughter, and the chaos of raising 3 children, and Margaret often thought back to those dark days after her parents died when she had felt so alone. If someone had told her then that she would end up here, married to a wonderful man and surrounded by children and love, she would not have believed them. Gideon eventually became marshal when Jack Thornton retired, and he served in that role with distinction for many years. The frontier gradually became less wild as civilization spread, and the dangerous days of bandit attacks and shootouts became less frequent. But Gideon never forgot his origins, never forgot the day he had tracked a band of outlaws through the snow and found a schoolteacher cornered against a snowdrift, fighting for her life with quiet courage. Margaret taught for 15 years before finally retiring to focus on her family and her garden. Her students remembered her fondly as a teacher who had been firm but fair, who had believed in them even when they did not believe in themselves. She wrote the occasional article for the town newspaper and became involved in the campaign for women's suffrage, which Gideon supported wholeheartedly, despite the raised eyebrows of some of the more traditional men in town. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Gideon took Margaret back to Mill Creek to the little way station where they had spent those fateful 2 days together during the blizzard. The cabin was still there, maintained by the territory for travelers, and they spent the night there together, just the two of them, reliving memories and making new ones. "You ever regret it?" Gideon asked as they lay together in the narrow bed, wrapped in each other's arms. "Marrying a marshal, living this life." "Not for one single moment," Margaret said firmly. "You gave me everything I never knew I needed, Gideon. Love and adventure and a family and a purpose. How could I possibly regret any of it? Even the nights you spent worrying while I was out on patrol." "Even those," Margaret confirmed, "because you always came back just like you promised. You always came back to me." Gideon kissed her softly. "I always will," he murmured. "For as long as I live, I will always come back to you," and he did. Through 30 more years of marriage, through watching their children grow and marry and have children of their own, through the slow transformation of the frontier into civilization, Gideon and Margaret built a life together based on the foundation they had laid in those first desperate days when he had saved her life, and she had saved his heart. When Gideon finally retired as marshal at the age of 60, he and Margaret bought a small ranch outside of Walla Walla where they raised horses and enjoyed their numerous grandchildren. They would sit together on the porch in the evenings, Gideon's arm around Margaret's shoulders, and watch the sun set over the mountains. Sometimes they would talk about the old days, about bandits and snowstorms and impossible rescues. But mostly they just enjoyed being together. Two souls who had found each other against all odds and held on tight. Gideon lived to be 78 years old, dying peacefully in his sleep with Margaret holding his hand. She mourned him deeply, but without bitterness, knowing that they had been blessed with more than 50 years together, more happiness than most people ever knew. She lived another 5 years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And when she died at the age of 81, they buried her next to Gideon in the cemetery on the hill, overlooking Walla Walla. Their headstone was simple, just their names and dates and a single inscription that their children chose together. He saved her life. She gave him a reason to live. Together they found love. And in the end, that was the truth of it. Two people who had met in the worst possible circumstances, who had chosen each other despite every obstacle, and who had built something beautiful and lasting from the ashes of tragedy. It was a story that would be told and retold in Walla Walla for generations. The tale of the schoolteacher and the marshal who had fallen in love during a blizzard and never fallen out. Years later, one of their great-granddaughters, a girl named Margaret after her great-grandmother, asked her own grandmother, Grace, to tell her the story of how it all began. Grace, now an old woman herself, smiled and began the way she always did. "It was a cold winter day in 1882, and your great-grandmother was cornered by bandits in a snowdrift. She thought she was going to die. But then a cowboy appeared on the ridge above her, a deputy marshal named Gideon Walker, and he killed 4 of those bandits so fast that the others ran away in fear. That was the day everything changed. That was the day 2 souls found each other in the wilderness and decided to never let go." And so the story lived on, passed down through the generations, a testament to the power of love and courage, and the unexpected ways that lives could intersect and change forever. Margaret and Gideon had started with nothing but hope and determination, and they had built an empire of love that would outlast them both, touching lives they would never meet, inspiring hearts they would never know. It was more than either of them could have imagined on that cold December morning when their eyes first met across a snowdrift, but it was exactly what they both deserved. A love story for the ages, written in the wild frontier and sealed with a promise that neither ever broke. to love each other, honor each other, and always, always come home.